Hello, this is the Death Row and Executions channel. My name is Paco Rivera and I do presentations on an execution happening soon with a story on what got the death row inmate sentenced to death. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more death row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel here on YouTube called The Maximum Sentence, where I cover a recent crime and conviction. There will also be a link for that. According to a victim whose name is not provided in official court records or any public documents, on March 13th of the year 1980, a man named Dennis Michael Sochor forced her out of a cocktail lounge in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and made her get into a car. He then drove to a remote area, forced her into a camper that was attached to a vehicle, and then brutally violated her against her will. That victim survived when she was able to escape, and she later returned to that camper with a police officer. Sochor was still there, and he was arrested and later convicted of that crime. Dennis Sochor was sentenced in September of that year, 1980, to 1 year in jail and 5 years probation. Skipping ahead for just a moment, a court would eventually throw out that sentence and he would be resentenced on November 2nd, 1987 to life in prison for that crime. And that same day, he was also sentenced to death for a crime he had committed 2 years later in January of 1982. So about 2 years after the indecent assault of the unidentified victim who escaped and survived, on December 31st, 1981, New Year's Eve, 18-year-old Patricia Marie Gifford was accompanied by a friend named Delta Harville to celebrate the new year at a place called the Banana Boat Lounge in Broward County near Fort Lauderdale. They had driven there in the friend's car, Delta's car. Patricia had a boyfriend at the time, but he had to work that night and could not join in on the New Year celebration. Patricia and Delta had arrived at the Banana Boat Lounge at about 9 o'clock that night. While sitting at a tiki bar at the Banana Boat Lounge, Patricia and Delta were approached by two men, two brothers, Dennis Sochor, who was 29 years old at the time and still on probation after doing his 1 year in jail for violating a woman, and his brother Gary Sochor. Investigators would later learn that Dennis Sochor was also wanted in the state of Michigan for violating a woman there. The brother Gary had actually traveled from Michigan to Florida a few days earlier to spend some time with his brother. Both brothers had left Dennis Sochor's home in his work truck, a vehicle that belongs to his employer. Dennis and Gary Sochor had spent much of the evening drinking and chatting with the two young ladies, something that Delta Harville would later testify about in court. Delta would even take a photo of her friend Patricia at that New Year's Eve party at the Banana Boat Lounge with one of the two brothers, Dennis Sochor, standing behind her. A photo that would later lead investigators to the identity of Dennis Sochor when Patricia was reported missing the following day, resulting in Sochor being considered a person of interest to detectives. At midnight, the four of them, along with many others in the bar that night, rang in the new year, 1982. However, unfortunately, sometime about 2 o'clock in the morning, Delta, who had too much to drink, had become sick. So Patricia and the two brothers helped take Delta to her car out in the parking lot, and Delta went to sleep in the car. The three of them then went back inside the Banana Boat Lounge, where they continued celebrating into the early morning hours. When they decided to call it a night, The three of them walked back over to Delta's car, and she was still asleep. Patricia had mentioned that her friend was probably not well enough to drive yet, so Dennis Sochor suggested that she go with him and his brother Gary to go have breakfast somewhere, and that Delta should probably be okay to drive by the time they all returned. Patricia made the biggest mistake of her young life when she agreed. The three of them got into Dennis Sochor's work truck with Patricia sitting between the two brothers. But Dennis and Gary Sochor did not take Patricia to go get breakfast. Instead, Dennis Sochor drove to an isolated area where he forced Patricia out of the truck and into the woods. According to reports, their brother Gary had remained in the truck. But when he heard the young woman screaming, he got out and walked over into the woods, and from a distance, he yelled at his brother to stop assaulting her. Gary said that he even threw a rock at his brother, but that his brother became very angry. He was infuriated. Possessed is the word that he had used, and yelled at him to get back into the truck, and that's what he did. Sometime later, Dennis Sochor returned to the truck, and the two brothers went back to his home, where he dropped off his brother Gary before leaving again. Gary went to sleep, but later that morning, he said that he went to the truck to retrieve some personal items of his, and inside the truck, he found keys, a single shoe, and a sweater that Patricia had with her. Gary knew these items all belonged to the woman that they had left in the woods. When Gary confronted his brother about the woman's items found in the truck, Dennis Sochor immediately took them from Gary and got rid of them. Those items were never found. Gary would later say that his brother then proceeded to completely wash and clean the exterior and interior of the truck completely. That same day, it would seem that Delta woke up in her car back at the Banana Boat Lounge parking lot and drove away, realizing that her friend is missing. Her disappearance was reported to Broward County Police with information about the two brothers that had been with them. The photo that Delta had taken was eventually developed, and local news broadcasts had later reported the missing woman on television, showing that photo, the one you are seeing here. By the time that happened, the brother, Gary, had flown back to Michigan. But apparently, Dennis Sochor had roommates who were watching television with Sochor, and they all saw the news report about the missing woman and how police are looking for the man standing behind her in the photo and the brother. Well, according to the roommates, that's when Dennis Sochor immediately jumped out of his seat, quickly packed some things that he threw into his work truck, and left, and never came back. He was obviously afraid that police would come knocking on the door any minute. And he was right. After police received the tip on the identity of the man in the picture, they went to the home where Dennis Sochor was living. With Sochor now long gone, police interviewed the roommates, who told them exactly what happened after watching that news broadcast. Police also got information for contacting the brother, Gary Sochor, in Michigan. And when he was called, while he didn't know for sure that the woman was dead, he gave up everything that happened that New Year's Day morning, including telling them that he found a shoe and other items belonging to Patricia in that truck. Gary agreed to fly back to Florida to help find his brother, and also to lead detectives to the routes that they had taken that morning with Patricia in the car. It would later be learned that Dennis Sochor, when he fled the home where he was living in Fort Lauderdale, had driven to Tampa in his employer's work truck, and he abandoned the truck there. He then traveled by bus to New Orleans, Louisiana, and then later moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Nobody had any idea that he was there for the next 4 years. In May of the year 1986, Dennis Sochor was stopped by police in DeKalb County, Georgia, for running a red light and driving under the influence. After booking him for the driving violations, police in Georgia realized that he was a wanted fugitive. Florida detectives then traveled to Atlanta to interview him, and apparently Sochor couldn't deal anymore with looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life and gave a full audio recorded confession. He also took that time to let the detectives know that he was also wanted in Michigan for what he did to a woman there. Sochor was later extradited back to Florida. He told investigators that he took the body of Patricia Gifford to the Everglades and disposed of it there. He even tried to give directions to the exact location, and a massive search had ensued, but to this day, her body was never found, which is often the case with bodies being dumped in the alligator-infested Everglades swamps. By the time the case went to trial in 1987, with the brother, Gary Sochor, as the primary witness, the defense mostly relied on a strategy of how there was no proof that Patricia Gifford was dead because no body was ever found. That didn't work. The prosecution had multiple audio recorded confessions from Sochor that was played for the jury. He was later convicted of murder, and in November of 1987, he was sentenced to death. And after a court threw out his sentence for the 1980 indecent assault conviction, he was also sentenced to life in prison for that crime on that same day. Not that it means much, but he was also sentenced for kidnapping, and he got a sentence of 5 years for stealing his company's work truck by driving it to Tampa without their permission. It appears the state of Michigan did not pursue taking Sochor to trial since he already had a life sentence and a death sentence in the state of Florida. This year, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant for Sochor for him to be executed on July 14th of this year, 2026. There has been talk about why the brother was not also charged. While he was present, so to speak, during the assault and murder, some say he should have been charged as well for not having done enough to stop it. And he never reported the assault of a woman in the woods and finding her personal items in his brother's vehicle later that morning. However, Florida prosecutors concluded that Gary was not a physical accomplice to the homicide. He said he tried to stop it, but became afraid of his brother. Because Gary lacked the intent to commit a crime and tried to stop it, he did not, according to the state, meet the legal threshold for an accomplice to murder. Gary was also the first person to officially implicate his brother to Broward County detectives. He voluntarily returned to Florida from Michigan, took police through the driving routes to help look for Patricia's body, and testified extensively for the state during the trial. Because he did not help plan the crime, participate in the killing, or help hide the body, prosecutors chose to use him to secure a first-degree murder conviction against Dennis Sochor rather than charging him as an accessory. A journalist from the country of Norway wrote a book about Dennis Sochor after exchanging over 200 pen pal letters with him over the years. The book mostly details Sochor's frustrations with extreme isolation while on death row in Florida, complaining how he is allowed only 5 hours a week out of his cell to walk in the courtyard. And because of that, the author offers her views on how the justice system in the United States is engaging in cruel and unusual punishment with death row inmates such as Dennis Sochor. Please go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more of these death row and upcoming execution stories so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Thank you for watching. Take care and bye for now.